Good afternoon. I'm Lee Brandstetter. As a member of the Committee on the Security of America's Medical Product Supply Chain, I would like to welcome everyone, especially our guest presenters. I want to note that this is an open, on-the-record information gathering session. That is, the committee is in the process of assembling materials that it will examine and discuss in the course of making its findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Therefore, I ask everyone here today to be extremely mindful of the fact that the committee has made no conclusions and that it would be a mistake for anyone to leave here today thinking otherwise. Comments made by individuals, including members of the committee, should not be interpreted as positions of the committee or of the academies. For those of you not familiar with the committee process, this is a committee information gathering session. Some of the committee's meetings include public sessions where we have the opportunity to hear from many experts in the field and receive public testimony. The committee will deliberate thoroughly before writing its draft report. Moreover, once the draft report is written, it must go through a rigorous review by experts who are anonymous to the committee, and the committee must then respond to this review with appropriate revisions that adequately satisfy the Academy's report review committee and the chair of the National Research Council before it is considered an NRC report. The expected report release is the first quarter of 2022. Further information on the study, including future meetings, can be found on the project website. This committee is being asked to first assess and evaluate the dependence of the United States, including the private commercial sector, states, and the federal government on critical drugs and devices that are sourced or manufactured outside of the United States. And two, provide recommendations to improve the resilience of the supply chain for critical drugs and devices and address supply vulnerabilities or potential disruptions of such products that would significantly affect or pose a threat to public health security or national security. Today, this public session will focus on trade policy issues to improve the resilience of the medical product supply chain. In the interest of time, we're going to be very brief in our introduction of speakers. We'll just introduce them by name, title, and affiliation. During the question and answer session, only the committee will be able to ask questions and provide comments. And this is to ensure adequate time for discussion with the committee. So we'll now get
Recording
started
in progress
with our first panel session. It's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Monica Gorman, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Manufacturing, Industry and Analysis in the International Trade Administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Each panelist is going to have 7 to 10 minutes for a presentation. We can allow the committee to ask clarifying questions immediately following each presentation, and then we're going to move to a broader panel discussion. Ms. Gorman will be followed by Carter Wilbur, an economic officer in the Office of Multilateral Trade Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. So thank you both. Ms. Gorman, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Lee. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. As you said, I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Manufacturing at the International Trade Administration here at the Department of Commerce. I assumed this role on March 1st, coming from 2 decades in the private sector where I worked primarily in supply chains. So this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. Great to be here with you today and to talk about really just the critical importance of medical supply chain resiliency to the U.S. trade agenda. Today I'm going to discuss a lot of the challenges that we see related to supply chains and what we are doing to leverage trade in order to strengthen supply chain resiliency. And as a top line, more than 40 million American jobs depend on trade, and trade is critical to the success of many sectors of the U.S. economy. It is absolutely critical also to position U.S. manufacturers to be competitive in a global market. Here in the International Trade Administration and the Industry and Analysis Division, where I sit, our teams of industry and trade experts, we generate leading edge sector and market intelligence, including trade data. We provide critical advice on international trade and investment policies affecting the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturers in the global market. And we manage programs that promote exports of U.S. manufactured goods, and we also help to monitor and enforce trade agreements. We work very, very closely with U.S. industry, and together with that partnership, we develop and advance strategies, policies, programs to really position U.S. manufacturers to be at the forefront of international competitiveness. So we represent the trade interests of US industry with other governments, in in international organizations, and in various bilateral forums. And it's fair to say that US manufacturers face a variety of trade restrictions and challenges to accessing foreign markets. In response, we seek to develop strategies and advocate directly with our foreign government counterparts to address these barriers to US trade and investment. And this is what we call commercial diplomacy. So our work includes everything from engaging in trade negotiations to proactively address trade and regulatory barriers to looking at other ways that access to international markets may be restricted. As we all know, we're still in the middle of this pandemic, and COVID-19, really more than any event in recent memory, has highlighted just how important it is that we have resilient, diverse, and secure supply chains, particularly in the medical sector. So let me take a deeper dive into the medical device sector here just briefly. So US medical technology companies globally sold $147 billion worth of products in 2018. And in 2020, US medical technology companies exported $44 billion globally. The top export markets are the EU, China, and Japan. MedTech companies employ 372,000 Americans and indirectly support 2 million additional American jobs. Interestingly, of the 6,500 medical device companies in the United States, approximately 80% are SMEs. So that just gives you a sense of the industry that we're talking about here. And Commerce is really working diligently both across the US government and with industry to create strong and optimal conditions that support trade in these medical products, while also addressing the barriers that are there head on. So what are we doing in terms of supply chains and on medical products in particular? A few that I'd like to highlight here. Commerce is co-leading the task force on supply chain disruptions together with the Departments of Transportation and Agriculture. We regularly, and by regularly, I mean multiple times a day, speak with industries who are affected by supply chain challenges. And we have really a team of sector specialists. It's been one of the highlights, I think, of my time so far, is getting to know our sector specialists who are working with industry to devise solutions. We work across the interagency to assess medical product supply chains and support the US public health industrial base, whether that's with HHS or state or other agencies. And then Commerce in particular has played a lead role in writing the 100-day supply chain report for semiconductors, some of which go into medical products and has created some challenges recently with the shortage. And we also contributed to the development of the other 100-day reports, particularly pharmaceuticals. And Commerce is leading a one-year supply chain report on the information and communications technology sector, but also supporting other one-year reports, including on the public health industrial base. So those reports were released on June 8th. They contain a variety of recommendations to address the risks associated with these key supply chains. The 4 reports looked at semiconductors, critical minerals and strategic materials, high capacity batteries, and pharmaceuticals, including active pharmaceutical ingredients. So I really encourage the committee, hopefully you've had a chance to take a look, but if not, please take a look at those reports. They really provide a good roadmap that now we will flesh out further with the work around the one-year reports. On semiconductors specifically, I do want to note that we know that these widespread semiconductor shortages have affected many segments of the economy as well, and including medical technologies. So to that end, on just recently on September 23rd, we've announced that we are creating an early alert system for industry. This is being led by the Department of Commerce, but we will work with the interagency, and it's meant to proactively manage semiconductor supply chain disruptions linked to key products, and that would include in the health sector. So we have an intake email address. It is covid_microelectronics_alert@trade.gov. And we invite industry, if you are experiencing a COVID-related disruption to your semiconductor chip supply, to please let us know. It alerts us in real time. It allows us to bring the resources of the US government to bear to see what we can do to help to address those issues. So again, an attempt here to recognize in real time some of these disruptions and to address it in real time where possible. Let me turn briefly to trade policy mechanisms. So some of the mechanisms that we're using to address supply chain resilience, as well as product shortages, would be things like trade facilitation procedures. How can we address issues related to paperwork documentation, customs clearance, licensing certification? How can we look at redundant product testing requirements? And then last but certainly not least, undertaking a close examination of Section 301 and the exemptions associated there. We know that there have been a very significant paperwork backlogs that have arisen during the pandemic that has really hindered the movement of medical product components and finished goods, and many persist even after 18 months into this pandemic. We also know that requirements such as local product testing has also hindered the movement, where testing facilities have not been able to keep up. In addition, the Section 301 exclusion process, we know that that is a critical policy mechanism that is led by USTR. Just a note on that, USTR opened a 30-day window from late August to late September for stakeholders to submit petitions asking for extensions of health product tariff exclusions related to COVID-19, and USTR is reviewing those petitions now with input from Commerce. A separate petition process covering 549 tariff exclusions, not limited to health products, was announced earlier, and USTR is going to be releasing more details shortly about that process. I believe it is intended to launch on October 12th, next week. Talking about product shortages for a moment, we know that the US public health supply chain is going to remain vulnerable to future disruptions unless we really have some foresight here and really think transformationally about long-term investment. Systemic investments can be used to address medical product shortages. So one example of this is the Infrastructure Act, which passed the Senate on August 10th. It has many important economic priorities that, if enacted, will better position the United States to compete globally and will strengthen our supply chains here at home. It really is the US government's vision to protect the health and security of Americans by ensuring dependable supply chains for PPE, for medical devices, for medicines, and other public health supplies. This was described in the National Strategy for a Resilient Public Health Supply Chain in July 2021. And there's really three goals in that vision. One is building that diverse, agile public health supply chain and sustaining long-term US manufacturing that will provide resiliency for future pandemics. The second goal is to transform the government's ability to monitor and manage public health supply chains through stockpiles, visibility, and other types of engagement. And the third goal is to establish the standards, systems, and governance necessary to manage the supply chain and ensure fair, equitable, and effective allocation of resources. I do want to note that from a trade policy point of view, a key focus area for us here at Commerce is developing partnerships with other economies. We are participating in a number of different bilateral and multilateral dialogues, and conversations with other countries have included assessing which components and raw materials can be reliably and productively manufactured in other markets as well as here in the United States, because we know that while certain things need to be made here, not everything is likely to be made here. And so where do we want to nearshore or friendshore some of those key components and materials? Just thinking here a little bit further, I should say that pretty early on in the pandemic, Commerce learned of many cases in markets around the world where the manufacturing of raw materials and components for medical products was either scaled back or was shut down due to lockdowns. And these problems do still exist or are rising sporadically in critical markets. And it could take multiple days and sometimes only after direct advocacy by Commerce for government officials in certain key foreign markets to grant waivers to those factories so that they could resume production. So these restrictions are challenging and something that we need to look at going forward to ensure that the manufacturing of these critical components and materials can continue. And I think I'd like to close here by noting one other aspect, and this is really a role for the private sector, and that's a rethinking of risk management for medical product companies. We've seen a number of situations where manufacturers relied on sole suppliers for critical components. And so when unexpected things happened, they couldn't get the quantities that they needed to meet public health or hospital demand. Many times they didn't have sufficient visibility upstream into their supply chains, not just to their second tier, but their third tier, their fourth tier suppliers, and didn't realize that they had sole source reliance there. So we know that a lot of medical companies are increasingly engaged in reimagining their risk and thinking about possible worst case scenarios, but we really want to encourage the private sector to think a bit more about supply chain risks and build that into their planning, into their mapping, into their procurement strategies, so that they also have just within their own supply chains a bit more resiliency, because it's not if a crisis happens, it's when. So let's plan for that. Let's build that into the planning, and it will better position us in the future as unexpected situations arise. And I will close my remarks there. I'm looking forward to hearing the other panelists and also the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I turn the floor over to Carter Wilber, are there any urgent clarifying questions from the committee members? All right. Okay, seeing no hands raised, Carter Wilber, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lee. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carter Wilber. As you heard, I'm a U.S. State Department Economic Officer in the Office of Multilateral Trade Affairs in the State Department's Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. I will attempt to not duplicate too much of what Das Gorman said. I think we'll hear the similarities between what we have to say. So I will hopefully give a little bit more insight and go a little bit deeper in a few different areas. But first of all, I want to thank you, Lee, and the committee for the opportunity to join your discussion today. Stage for the discussion by saying that I agree with the premise of the committee's study topic. The United States does need resilient, diverse, secure medical supply chains to ensure our collective health security, our economic prosperity, and really our national security. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly impacted our abilities, but that's not the only thing. Cyber attacks, climate shocks, extreme weather events, terrorist attacks, geopolitical and economic competitive competitions, these all expose the vulnerabilities in the availability and integrity of critical goods, products, and services. The State Department role is to work with our allies and partners to build a diplomatic framework for agreements that will secure partnerships to make global investments in resilient supply chains really work. Now, I want to turn to some of the factors relevant to how we address those vulnerabilities and provide you with some of my thoughts. I draw your attention to what is sort of considered a natural tension between efficiency, cost effectiveness, and resilience. It's critical to understand how all of these work together in the public and private sector outlook and their approach. If you look back at trade structures, even as late as mid-2019, the dominant theory was a just-in-time manufacturing paradigm. A producer wanted the bare minimum of capital tied up in inventory. And forgive me if I'm lecturing to the more knowledgeable, but that sets the stage that looking at this, you can see even before the pandemic, and really by really taking root in early 2020, the discussion shifted to seeming in case structure, and certainly the pandemic amplified that. Conversations that I had with institutional investors and market makers, they related their evaluations of a just-in-time based company meant a deeper dive into how that company justified use that dime, whether they were relying on a vertical integration model or something else, but they needed to explain why they were doing that. So businesses were embracing the idea that some additional cost through lost efficiency to establish resilience in their supply chains was acceptable. And I think that's an important point, that we saw that even before the pandemic really took hold. Now, the precise amount of acceptable additional cost is going to vary by industry and over time, and what any curve of acceptable inefficiencies will look like remains to be seen. But history tends to show that competitive industries will seek increased efficiencies for short-term comparative advantage. And that makes it reasonable to assume that absent any kind of external force, factor, or shock, that efficiency will tend to increase over time at the expense of resilience. Now, improved efficiency is only one of the strengths of a free market system. And as the basis of the study shows, it can be a weakness when external events challenge the efficient movement of raw materials, intermediate goods, or finished products through what turns out we may not even known they were, but is a enzyme. And by the same token, a diverse supply chain can reinforce cost efficiencies, and by variety of ways, including competitive pricing. There's a valid distinction to be made between diverse and resilient in terms of supply chains. A diverse supply chain covers a variety of factors, such as geographic or multiple supplier or a range of small, medium, and large companies in their supply chain. Whereas I view resilience as more of an overall statement that the supply chain minimizes points of failure. So that's more of a qualitative judgment on the whole supply chain, I think. For a diverse group of producers in terms of size and corporate ownership, but is all located in one country, it is not a really resilient one because it's not geographically diverse. So the political decision not to trade with the United States could also result in a diverse supply chain tax resiliency if that diversity is located in one political jurisdiction. So the objective then is for supply chains to be resilient, diverse, and secure. And as Das Gorman pointed out, the Biden administration, the National Strategy for a Resilient Public Health Supply Chain is publicly available, and I encourage you to do that as part of its information gathering process if you haven't already, which I assume you have. This strategy encompasses how to build and sustain U.S. domestic manufacturing, complemented by strategic near and allied shoring trade. To be clear, the U.S. cannot achieve the goals of a resilient supply chain without our allies and reliable trading partners. Along with domestic and this allied manufacturing, the strategy envisions a range of efforts to improve supply chains, such as building in redundancies, improving agility, and the ability to rapidly respond to changes in demand, maintaining adequate stockpiles, increasing visibility and analytics to monitor the public health supply chains, and supporting world-class American manufacturing base and workforce. Now, close cooperation on resilient supply chains with allies and partners who share our values will foster this collective economic and national security goal and strengthen the capacity to respond to international disasters and emergencies. Here again, what's really important is that ability to respond to the unplanned or unpredictable events, having that resilience and adaptability as well. Now, the international trading relationships also enable U.S. domestic producers to maintain capacity, whether that's a baseline or even beyond that as a surge capacity that is called for in a purely domestic U.S. market. They can do that by exporting the excess that exceeds the domestic demand into international markets, but we have to have those trading relationships in place. Regarding domestic manufacturing, I defer to Das Gorman and the Commerce and other domestic agencies on that, but I will note there's an interplay between some of the proposed domestic growth strategies and our current international trade obligations, such that the use of certain strategies could have some unintended consequences. Now, for example, some potential mechanisms for encouraging domestic production could be challenged and inconsistent with existing international trade commitments. Many of these trade commitments are beneficial to the United States. There's a net gain for U.S. businesses by opening certain U.S. markets to competition, and in exchange, we receive access to larger foreign markets. So these commitments could reap significant unintended negative consequences to U.S. businesses. Now, that being said, I do believe that we can successfully navigate the landscape of our existing trade commitments, which benefit U.S. businesses and workers, and support good U.S. paying jobs in our export industries, while working with our allies and trading partners to strengthen both our overall trade relationships and our global medical supply chains. Now, one example of this is the recent notice of proposed rulemaking related to Buy American policies. This shows that there is a way to use U.S. government procurement dollars, for example, in ways that is consistent with our international trade obligations to achieve specific policy goals. Now, when specifically addressing the trade in critical items needed in response to a global public health crisis, whether it's vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, other medical products, naturally, one of the issues that arises is the likelihood that these items are also needed in the exporting country's own domestic markets. And we have seen that through the pandemic experiences. Now, in general, our WTO commitments and the WTO agreements have some flexibility how emergency trade restrictions related to, for example, national security, health, or other reasons. Now, these might otherwise contravene the WTO obligations. These agreements, and this is very important, however, they do require that any such restrictions be targeted, temporary, transparent, and non-discriminatory. I cannot stress this enough that these emergency measures must not be used as a backdoor attempt at trade protectionism. I believe that everyone agrees that we can always do better in terms of the level of detail, the accuracy and the fidelity and the information we have concerning our trade estimates and the medical supply chain specifically. This consequently limits our ability to fully understand where our vulnerabilities are. And as pointed out, this is where it is critical to have that feedback loop with industry. To hear what is really happening and to have that honest understanding of where the genuine problems are, and which tells us what we can do in terms of responses for them. Trade estimates are, as I said, so important, and state is happy to work with our international trade colleagues such as USTR and the Department of Commerce to provide inputs to the broader planning and capacity examination process. It's focused on these international trade aspects of the medical supply chains. Efforts along this line are already underway as part of the executive order on medical supply chain implementation. Regarding promoting the domestic accessibility of devices, refer to the relevant USG agencies such as HHS, FDA, and even Commerce. Where international trade can promote the accessibility, state works to support the efforts through our existing interagency coordination processes and our ability to reach out and negotiate with foreign counterparts. In sum, there are various opportunities to pursue how to promote supply chain diversification, security, and resiliency, including onshoring and reshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring. Nearshoring concerns addressed, friendshoring addresses political concerns. Each of these options has different pros and cons across a wide range of factors, which I'm sure we'll get more into in our discussion in a minute, including cost effectiveness, efficiency, existing capacity, and sustainability versus demand needs, and the availability of labor, raw materials, intermediate good in the production processes. Regardless, resiliency, diversification, and security are critical to the long-term health of Americans and of America's public health supply chains. And we have benefits ranging from ensuring competitiveness to promoting innovation to providing geographic spread for redundancy from environmental and transportation disruptions. I will close my remarks by just saying that I'm happy to be part of this process, and it is a real honor to work on this important topic. I look forward to speaking with you more about this in the question period.
Thank you very much for these remarks, and thanks also for adhering to our time limits, which continue to bind us, right? So this first panel and discussion is scheduled to conclude at around 1:50 p.m., which is quite close. I would like to invite the committee members to pose questions. And if they'll forgive me, I'll start by invoking the chair's privilege here to kick us off with one, which is, Carter, you mentioned that, WTO agreements do allow for restrictions on exports, for instance, key medical products. And yet, in the context of a global health emergency, these export restrictions, even if permissible, can impact the resilience of supply chains and the availability of products around the world. Might there be some scope for negotiation or even international agreements that could further constrain these and coordinate supply chains in a way that makes these disruptions less likely. I welcome comments on that, from both you, Carter, and from Monica as well.
I guess since it was directed to me first, I'll go first, and then Des Gorman, I'll leave the cleanup for you to fix anything I say wrong. You're absolutely right, and I think there is some discussion about the role of this of the international trading regime. I do think there are a lot of political concerns that every country has to look at. There is always a balance between domestic need and your trade obligations and commitments. I think any changes to the existing structure result of very lengthy negotiations. And even if it is something that the majority of countries agree to, in any kind of negotiation like that, there is the chance that somebody is going to want something else. Just great deal complicated. So I think it's not unreasonable, but I think it would be the result of a very lengthy process. And it's all fun and games until you get the lawyers involved, which is what would happen to no doubt with that. So there's a lot of concerns that would go into that. So I think that's a very roundabout way of saying not a completely outlandish idea, but one that is fraught with complexities and will be the result of lengthy negotiations. Thanks.
I think Carter summarized it well. I think it's there's merit to the idea, but enacting it is challenging given the complexities of the situation that we're in. Lee, I did, since I have the floor, I'll take the prerogative. I did notice a question in the chat in terms of resiliency and whether or not resiliency, it's an inherently objective or subjective concept, which is true, but the working definition that we have right now is resiliency is sort of the ability to recover quickly from a disruption. So I do think there's opportunity for objective metrics to measure the time to recover from a type of disruption, and would welcome thoughts from the academic community as to what would be the ways in which that could be done at different points in the supply chain to start to build that into thinking around supply chain. So if we want supply chain resiliency, what are the metrics that show your ability, your time to recover? Ideally, it is as short as possible, because that shows that you're resilient to a shock. So just putting that out there, that's sort of the working definition that we have at the moment. But I think there's a real opportunity here for the academic community to think about how that could be measured, and we would welcome that. And frequency, yes, potentially. Sorry, I just see the monitoring the chat in real time, but frequency for sure. Clearly, the more frequent your disruptions, you would want to take a look at, do you have appropriate diversification or the appropriate supply base, such that you can never eliminate disruptions, but you certainly don't want to be dealing with constant disruptions as well. So would really welcome some thoughts and probably a conversation beyond the scope of this panel or the time that we have here today, but definitely an evolving area of thought for us.
Thanks. Aaron.
Quick clarification with regard to the Buy American proposals. Is there any thought to requirements for industry to disclose location of production so that we know how to actually implement that? For example, if the DoD only has to buy medications that are produced in America, with the current lack of transparency, how does that get implemented?
Well, I mean, to that extent, Buy American wouldn't really work that way. The provisions of Buy American essentially establish price preferences for domestic goods over foreign goods with our trade partners, that we have trade agreements with them that have a specific chapter on government procurement, or that are fellow members of the WTO's agreement on government procurement. And that's where we get into what we open up in our markets is a small percentage, well, is much less than what we get access to in the world government procurement markets. So I don't know that anyone is talking about completely walling off sectors of the American economy, because it's just too many things marketing partners for that to really effectively work. That being said, you chosen a great example with DoD, which is carved out of many of those agreements. So they're not actually bound by that. They do when they can, but they have some different latitude just because requirements. So the devil's in the details, but I don't know that there's really an attempt to pull up drawbridges as much as really look at where we have already negotiated carve-outs for, like, for example, small business. What can we do to extend the use of American government procurement dollars for policy reasons that are not contravening our existing trade obligations?
I think I would add to that in terms of, if you look at Buy American for pharmaceuticals, I believe the threshold is currently unclear, and that there's been a court ruling saying, for example, that the source of the APIs is irrelevant to determining the country of origin, which basically means that companies that buy APIs from China but finish their product here can still supply federal agencies. So there's opportunity there to think about how those rules are defined and applied. And if we want to encourage more API production in the United States, then that may be something we want to look at.
Any questions from other members of the committee?
Well, Lee, while we're waiting, I wanted to add one more set of thoughts to what Das Gorman said about resiliency, since I opened that can of worms to a degree in my remarks. I also want to make sure that just to plant the seed with the committee to look not just at COVID and not just at COVID Part 2, the sequel that may happen at some point in the future. When we're talking kinds of public health emergencies, let's really make sure we're thinking about the true black swan event. And just because we've made it through one black swan event of the COVID-19 pandemic now, doesn't mean the next black swan event is going to look like this one. What if the next black swan event is or purple swan? So that adaptability is also a big factor that I like to examine in the resiliency, and I would encourage the committee to look at. Of, all right, how quickly can we adjust from whatever we're doing now to respond to whatever the next emergency is, be it a pandemic, be it a food crisis, be it a natural disaster, or whatever. Thanks.
Thanks. Craig.
Thanks, Lee. For Ms. Gorman, you mentioned in the context of sole source vulnerabilities, the fact that many private sector entities have very little awareness of that vulnerability, which raises questions about the database that they, and more largely the government, has to anticipate where those vulnerabilities will be most concerning, and they're developing then an appropriate interventional strategy to mitigate that risk. And I know you mentioned it in the context of private sector's responsibility, but what is the federal national approach to establishing a database that would clarify these kinds of vulnerabilities to work towards a more comprehensive approach to risk mitigation? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I would point first to the work done during COVID with the HHS. It's called the Control Tower. So that was a partnership with industry producing critical products for the COVID response, where industry came together with HHS to provide proprietary information and provide that level of data that would allow government level monitoring. Now, that was an emergency situation. So there's a lot of questions and thought going forward as to what are the appropriate roles in non-emergency situations for government versus industry, but there's a lot I think we can learn from the HHS work here and what has worked well, where has government been helpful, where is it really the role of the private sector. There are slightly more macro levels as we think about supply chains writ large, not just in health, but in other sectors, semiconductors, for instance. We are thinking a lot about what is the role of data, what data what data can we get, what data should we be monitoring, how granular or not should the government be getting relative to what private industry is doing as well. That said, I do want to reinforce the point for private industry, coming from supply chains. When everything's working great, the industry is probably not paying a ton of attention to what's happening in tier 3, tier 4, tier 5. But what you don't know can hurt you. And it is possible to have visibility, but it takes time and resources to have visibility. So there is a real opportunity, I think, here for technology to assist with more transparency for businesses within their own supply chain, potentially policy tools to encourage businesses to have more visibility into their supply chains. Because at the end of the day, businesses do need to manage their own supply chains as well. So a long-winded way of saying there is definitely a role for government here, and there's a role for private sector here. There is some work to be done to define exactly what those roles are, but it's a very active line of conversation, and we have a lot to learn from HHS and from COVID, and I think that will inform going forward.
Thank you. Nice answer. More to be done.
Larry, you had a comment in chat. Well, kind of a comment and a question. Would you like to raise that for our two panelists?
Yeah, just wondering, is there a segment, is there a country, is there a group that you believe is a successful model or an aspirational model in terms of the approach and solution that's needed? I will tell you, the reason I'm asking the question is I don't know. I can't think of one because they're all suffering from sort of the same just-in-time reduction in inventory, and decisions are being made based on, cost drivers and earnings reports and, things like that, cash flow, not for the good of the supply chain.
I'll take the first stab, and Carter, feel free to respond. I don't know that I can think of any particular sector or country or company that's done this perfectly, but there are some, if I think at a company level in particular, some who have been less hard hit than others. And the strengths of those who have not been as disrupted typically has relied upon greater visibility to who their suppliers are, contract terms, contracts that are not designed just to exact the cheapest possible price at the latest possible time, but likely have a longer time horizon, and sort of stronger partnerships with their suppliers as a result. So to your point of maximizing profits throughout, that probably has a negative effect on resiliency if you're trying to extract every penny along the way. The more that there is visibility, transparency, and a time horizon that's a bit longer, the more likely there is to be strength and the ability to adapt when unexpected shocks happen. But is there anybody who's gotten it exactly right? It's hard to think of a specific example. We all have things to learn.
The generics seem to be a great example of what's not working. Very low margins, they just don't have any interest. The higher margin businesses seem to be the ones that tend to think about redundancy and resiliency more.
The only thing I would add to that is I also can't think of anybody that really got it exactly right. I would say more of a counterfactual, just anecdotally. If you remember back to 10 years ago in the Fukushima disaster aftermath, what they discovered was, I can't honestly remember whether it was Toyota or Honda, but one of the automakers, you could not get a black truck. You could not get a black pickup truck for them because the one company that made the black paint for their trucks was in the impacted area. So what does that mean? It means we haven't learned our lesson. We're not taking the lessons from history forward, so we're doomed to keep repeating them. So that indicates that there may really be a need for a policy rule or a policy intervention to guide business to making some of those better decisions, or at least making sure that those are things that are consciously thought through with businesses. But as I said, the margins of business are really going to be what dictates some of those discussions.
And supply chain visibility, we've talked about, used automotive as an example. We've talked about as a group how just seemingly wrong it is that in the automotive world, a manufacturer can tell you where every nut, bolt, screw, and component is made, who the supplier is, where it comes from, how it's flowing into the final assembly plant. And yet you can't do that in medicine or medical devices.
Any other final questions from the committee for our first two panelists? All right, well, thank you both, Carter and Dr. Gorman, for spending time with us and helping us understand these complex issues. We very much appreciate it. And now I'd like to turn to our next set of panelists. I'm going to briefly introduce each in the order in which we'll ask them to present. We'll be hearing from Jonathan Kimball, Vice President of Trade and International Affairs for the Association for Accessible Medicines. He'll be followed by Scott Commoners, who's an Associate Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. And Scott will be followed by Chad Bown, who's the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Same ground rules apply. After these very short to concise presentations, we'll have the opportunity for clarifying questions from the committee. And then when they're all done, we'll have another round of discussion. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lee. And just a quick preamble before I get to my prepared remarks. And Larry, you mentioned the generic industry, and I think you identified a lot of the problems, some of the challenges we have around margins, as well as the issue of sort of the supply chain and visibility into that. But I think, and I'd love to have this conversation, is what I'll be presenting in my remarks is actually some of the resiliency that is built into the system, even though we have some of the challenges you identified. So just wanted to put that bookmark there because I thought you raised an important point, but we as an industry come to a different conclusion. So, but maybe with that preamble over, I will start. So good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Kimball, and I'm the Vice President for Trade and International Affairs for the Association for Accessible Medicine. We are the trade association that represents the generic and biosimilar manufacturers in America. I would like to thank the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine for holding this important discussion. In the early days of COVID, strong concerns were voiced about the susceptibility of the US healthcare system to drug shortages due to the global nature of the US supply chain. Industry critics, members of Congress, and even senior FDA officials were all expressing concerns about likely supply disruptions. And while the global nature of the supply chain is very much true, the major disruptions that were warned against have not come to pass. When global transportation slowed in March and April 2021, some short-term supply disruptions did arise. However, based on analysis of IQVIA data, those disruptions were resolved by the end of April into early May, and the supply chain has, for the vast majority of products, performed exceptionally well since. And the reason those disruptions were minimal was because the generic industry had experienced supply disruptions in the past, and companies had contingency plans in place to address those disruptions if they emerged. From the conversations I've had with our members, the generics industry did not, and clearly isn't going forward, operate on a just-in-time principle, as was discussed earlier. But they actually held stocks, and a substantial amount of stock for months of production in hand, just in case this type of supply disruption did emerge. It's also important to note that the generics and biosimilar industry already plays an important role in US manufacturing. Our 23 member companies alone manufacture more than 60 billion doses in the US each year, employing more than 52,000 employees at 149 manufacturing plants across the country. And generic medicines play an integral role in healthcare and enhance patient access to life-saving treatments. The expiration or invalidation of patents and the resulting introduction of multiple generic and biosimilar manufacturers competing against each other, often other on price, result in savings for patients and the healthcare system. Over the last 10 years, manufacturers of generic medicines have delivered savings of more than $2 trillion, including $330 billion in 2020, to patients in the US healthcare system. As part of the industry's ongoing commitment for patient access, AAM released a 7-element framework that lays out concrete actions to ensure U.S. patients and the U.S. healthcare system have access to a secure and consistent supply of critical medicines. AAM's blueprint builds upon the existing generics manufacturing base, creating that I highlighted earlier. Creating the conditions that support and encourage this investment is necessary to ensure that the most critical medicines, those most essential to our country's health and security, are manufactured in the U.S. In order to establish this environment, AAM's blueprint recommends the following. Review and update at regular intervals the list of essential medicines, which was first released by the FDA in October 2020. Provide new grant and tax incentives to support increased U.S. manufacturing of essential medicines. Supply the Strategic National Stockpile, the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, and the Department of Defense with essential medicines on a long-term basis with guaranteed price and volume contracts. Leverage the Medicare and Medicaid programs to encourage domestic production of essential medicines. Reduce regulatory inefficiencies to streamline the federal approval of U.S.-based facilities to manufacture medicines. And finally, to promote a global cooperative approach diversifying the supply chain through the conclusion of the International Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Agreement. This is actually, I think, can maybe answer one of the questions, Lee, that you posed to begin the last conversation. Is there an agreement that could be in place to promote this type of resiliency in the supply chain? And I'll go into more detail about this proposal in a moment. Our blueprint, the AAM blueprint, includes actionable short-term steps to expedite more US-based production of essential medicines while putting in place a series of incentives to enhance the security of the US pharmaceutical supply chain. Given that modern manufacturing facilities can take 5 to 7 years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build, a long-term consistent commitment from the federal government is critical to building an expanded generic manufacturing base in the United States. Now, I'll spend the rest of my conversation speaking about trade and the supply chain. So prior to the COVID pandemic, trade in pharmaceuticals was very efficient. Thanks to the WTO 0 for 0 pharmaceutical agreement, most finished dosage and APIs faced little or no tariffs in most major markets. As a result of this free trade environment, the supply chain became very global. This was especially true for the generic industry, where prices were driven extremely low due to high levels of competition in the United States, the largest pharmaceutical market in the world. To stay competitive in this market, companies had to find cost savings through innovation and low-cost inputs. Those market dynamics, combined with the fact that the key starting materials and sources of API were often found in lower wage markets, resulted in an expansion of the production footprint from being predominantly in the US and Europe to being much more diverse, with China and especially India developing important domestic manufacturing capabilities. Today, the global generic manufacturing base touches all parts of the globe, from Europe to India, from Canada and Mexico to China and Vietnam. And yes, here in the US too. As I noted earlier, those 60 billion doses are made here in the United States each year by American workers employed across the country. But the focus of the COVID pandemic on the pharmaceutical supply chain makes it clear that more should be done to promote a resilient and redundant global supply chain and more manufacturing here in the United States. In the Biden administration's 100-day assessment of the US pharmaceutical supply chain, it was suggested that ensuring the resilience of our ally supply chain was in the US's best interest. I fully agree with this because the US can't alone produce all the medicines our patients need. We are most secure when the globally diverse supply chain is functioning well. From the viewpoint of AAM, that can best be accomplished through a renewed commitment by the US and our allies to promote free, unfettered trade in pharmaceuticals. Our proposed international pharmaceutical supply chain agreement does just that. We believe the US should lead the negotiation of a plurilateral agreement with its allies to renew a commitment to tariff-free trade in pharmaceuticals and AP, and to forego export bans on finished dosage and API in times of political upheaval, pandemics, or natural disasters. This agreement can help promote regulatory harmonization and more efficient trade facilitation, access to procurement markets, while also allowing countries to undertake programs that promote domestic manufacturing. We believe that this agreement can promote greater cooperation, coordination, and partnership between the United States and its allies that will be highly valuable in the face of the next global pandemic. But to get there, we need the US government to move this concept forward. There has been a lot of discussion about the need to secure the US pharmaceutical supply chain, and it is very welcome that there is now a bipartisan recognition that it must be done in concert with our allies. This agreement can serve as the framework to actualizing that goal, and we encourage negotiations to be started as soon as possible. The global nature of our supply chain provides us the resiliency that is so important to ensuring American patients have access to the medicines they need. Trade policy can be a tool to ensure that the benefits of this free trade regime continue, and that the US, in partner with our allies, is better positioned to ensure that whatever medicines are needed during the next pandemic, they are readily available. AM's proposal for the international pharmaceutical supply chain, if enacted, can contribute to that goal. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing this further.
Thanks very much. Any urgent clarifying questions from the committee before we proceed to the next presenter? Okay, seeing no hands, Scott, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be the sort of academic in the room and use a few slides with your permission. So my remarks here draw upon a broad array of work with a number of collaborators, mostly economists, also biostatisticians and policymakers in a group called the Accelerating Health Technologies team. We partnered together starting early in the pandemic in the United States, when the pandemic hit the United States, to start thinking about a number of questions, especially around vaccine innovation and production and distribution and allocation. Most of what I'm going to say today is captured in two of our prior papers, one in Science and one in the AEA Papers and Proceedings. First, let me sort of start with the punchline, or punchlines plural. We found that the economic costs of the pandemic are truly staggering, on the order of tens of trillions of dollars, in the first year. And as a result, there is a truly tremendous return to preparedness and to fast response in the event of a pandemic. That requires upfront investments in technology and production capacity, both nationally and globally. Additionally, and towards the supply chain and trade questions we're talking about today, the supply chain for vaccine production is inherently and unavoidably, global. There's no way to make it not so. And as a result, and very in concert with the remarks previously in this session, this necessitates real international collaboration and coordinated response, especially with US allies. And then in particular, towards ensuring that the correct investments are taken up front, and also to ensure that we can make a robust and quick response in the event of a pandemic or other, sort of major public health emergency, we need strong commitments to information and resource sharing. This is essential both upfront, and I'll detail this a little bit more, to ensuring the correct incentives to build production capacity and invest in technology for vaccines and other public health measures, and also for us to be able to scale up production quickly and make sure that we and everyone else has access to the resources they need. So first, just to set the sense of scale, so Operation Warp Speed was, sort of in the tens of billions of dollars. The IMF recently released an estimate for vaccinating 40% of the world population by end of this year and 60% by middle of next year at order of 50 billion. And these sound like really huge numbers, but the human and economic costs of the pandemic are orders of magnitude higher. So my collaborators and I, used sort of a number of different estimates of the health and economic costs and came up with numbers in the tens of trillions. So the value of vaccine capacity, sort of 3 billion courses per year, effective as of last year, would have been, approximately $17 trillion. And this is a measurement that accounts for sort of measurable economic losses and health losses, but not, sort of unhappiness, lots of other things that occur in the pandemic. It's actually, believe it or not, it's a conservative number. And that means that the value of additional capacity to produce vaccines and other, sort of in other parts of the public health response is also tremendous. So, we estimated that if we had been able to bring on an additional billion doses of capacity per year, effective April 2021, that would have been worth about $1 trillion in welfare. And even if we'd only, sort of at the state we were in July, if we were able to bring on another billion courses per year, that still would have been worth $250 billion. And so compared to the numbers we've actually been spending, that's, sort of where there's tremendous opportunity to invest more. The other thing that's essential, and this applies to sort of any type of public health investment, but especially when there's a lot of uncertainty about which technology is going to be useful and how much need you will have, we need upfront supply and capacity commitments. You need what we call push funding rather than pull funding. This is especially true in vaccine markets because market prices are typical, or rather the prices of the vaccines are typically held below market rates. Not by competition as in the case of generic drugs, but rather by sort of political agreements and support. And this disincentivizes firms from producing the optimal level of capacity. So you actually need direct government investments in capacity. That has a bunch of benefits in the short term, right? It speeds up vaccination, which saves lives and mitigates economic damage, but it also leads to lower prices in the long run. Towards the supply chain, vaccines rely on a truly global supply chain with a number of different inputs produced all over the world. There are some very unusual ones. LAL is used to sort of test for endotoxins and is found in horseshoe crab blood. The only natural occurrence, rather, is in horseshoe crab blood. We now have a synthetic, but the synthetic, was a relatively new innovation and had not gone through all of its sort of regulatory process at the start of the pandemic. So we need like a regulatory framework to make these sorts of substitute and efficient production inputs available. But we also need international collaboration. So we talked with some producers who explained that the types of medical grade bioreactors that were being used were only available, like the only manufacturer of these bioreactors was in Germany. And the process for constructing them was took a very long time. And so, you really needed to be able to buy them up front, and you needed to ensure an agreement or commitment that they could be exported. So what do you need for this supply chain to work? You need commitments to free export. Again, that's to ensure access in the times of need, and it's to incentivize you to take those upfront investments in capacity that are needed to make sure that you're ready in the case of an emergency. You need international market infrastructure, both to ensure that the inputs are not wasted, right? To the extent that there were just fundamental bottlenecks in production, not enough horseshoe crabs and such. You need to make sure that every unit you have is not wasted. And CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, as part of COVAX, organized a centralized marketplace whereby excess ingredients could be traded among companies in a way to make sure that we don't exhaust supply. This also has the effect of disincentivizing hoarding, right? So if you can guarantee that you can get what you need, then you have less incentive to hoard for yourself, which actually means that everyone has more access, right? If there's less hoarding, then the supply chain functions more efficiently in the first place. And then, as I mentioned, we need, investment and regulatory frameworks, in times, in peacetime, as it were, for supporting scale up at the time of an emergency. And that's like investment in synthetics, high yield production, sort of new R&D to make the inputs in the supply chain more accessible. And that goes to the resilience question. So in closing, sort of a variation of the points we started with, pandemics are global. They require coordinated global response, and also, responding to them requires global cooperation on supply chain and production. And its speed is really important, right? There were costs of information delays in our learning about the pandemic from China. And that allowed the pandemic to spread much more broadly and slowed down our response in terms of preparing vaccines and understanding other public health measures to institute. And then similarly, like even small, delays, like there was a couple of weeks delay in our providing certain inputs to India during the Delta wave in India, have tremendous human and economic costs, both, sort of immediately and downstream, right? Our inability to get the Delta variant under control has continued to cascade into economic and human costs in the United States and around the world. It's impossible to know what would have happened had we been able to help India, move their vaccination program ahead faster. But certainly, we would have mitigated some of those costs and also, decreased the extent of the incidents today. And then lastly, and let me emphasize once more that international commitments are essential for enabling countries to make the optimal investments, right? Without a commitment to be able to, that enables companies inside of countries to be certain that they can get the inputs they need, there's incentive to underinvest, and there's incentive to invest in the wrong portfolios because, you're sort of tied to just what you are certain you can get in the event of an emergency. Right, so you're going to underinvest in production capacity. You might, sort of choose to invest in the wrong, vaccines or the wrong technologies if you're concerned about supply chain disruption in a time of need. And especially given that these types of pandemic investments really need to be made up front, you sort of need a large push component, it's essential that we incentivize the optimal investments.
Thanks very much, Scott. Any urgent clarifying questions from the committee before we proceed to our final presenter? Okay, seeing no hands. Chad, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lee. So my name is Chad Bown. I'm an economist, a trade economist. I think a lot about trade agreements and supply chains, and during the pandemic have thought about the context this within the context of things ranging from PPE, which was the early days that I was worried about, to the last year and a bit worried about and thinking about vaccines. My remarks, I think, are very much going to piggyback of what Scott just went through. So I'm going to kind of build off and maybe tweak some of those, but I don't think there's much daylight in terms of what it is that I'm going to say in what Scott has already laid out. So let me just basically try to build on that. So thinking about this from an intervention perspective, when we started the pandemic on PPE, we had very little early intervention. In March, we finally removed some tariffs that were impeding imports from China. We invoked the Defense Production Act as export controls on PPE. And over the course of 2020 and even into 2021, we've built out the supply chain for PPE through industrial policy, but that took a very long time to get going and was very much sort of after the fact, and the worst days had passed of the PPE shortages. When it comes to vaccines, as Scott laid out, at least in the United States, things went very differently. It was relatively early. There was a diverse portfolio of candidates that were funded through Operation Warp Speed. It was relatively big. Investments were made at risk to get the manufacturing process up and running before the regulators had even authorized things. Some of the funding was given to vaccines that never made it through the regulatory process, and that's a good thing. We wanted to sort of over diversify there. And then in the United States, at least, there was subsidies to do this sort of investment to incentivize that Scott was talking about over the full supply chain. So not just the end manufacturers, but also some of the key input suppliers as well. So whether we're talking about the bioreactors, the filters, the cellular material, the providers of those, or the vials and stoppers and things like that, all of that was critical. And in the United States, another critical thing that both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have done is use of the Defense Production Act. And I think this is critical because we have to recognize that despite building out the input supply chain, there were still input shortages that were a tremendous problem. And so decisions had to be made that I'm not sure we would have wanted to just have I'm pretty sure we wouldn't have wanted to have markets make about which manufacturer, which plant in the face of input shortages should get the next piece of, whether it's a bioreactor or a bioreactor bag or filters, whatever, that rolls off the production line. Right? If Pfizer and Moderna have been accepted, we would probably prefer that the inputs go to them and not to AstraZeneca, which wasn't authorized in the United States, or Novavax, or one of the other ones, right? And so there's a critical role there for knowledgeable government policymakers through the Defense Production Act. There were embedded, military logistics folks. With the Biden administration, there's obviously Jeff Zients, and a whole team there in the White House that's coordinating this as well, to prioritize both what inputs should be going where, but then also with these vaccine manufacturers and their contracts, that they should be making vaccines and not other things. Okay, so I think that's critical. But doing this reduces transparency, because one thing that's really nice about markets is they help provide us with transparency. But when that market moment has passed and we really can't rely on markets, we really need to rely on the social planner. It is then incumbent on the social planner, the government in this case, to then inform the world about what it's actually doing. And when you don't do that, which is what both administrations did not do, then you get allegations by trading partners that you're imposing export controls, that you're imposing export restrictions, stopping inputs from going to India, stopping them from going to Europe, even if the problem is an underlying lack of inputs because of shortages, which is what is likely to have been the case, especially when for some of these vaccines, they were trying to scale up brand new production lines, all relying on the same exact inputs and pieces of capital equipment from the same few input providers at the same time. So these critical decisions had to be made. What does this mean? Well, as Scott indicated, the supply chain for this stuff is global. I think when it comes to vaccines, we have not really experienced as much of this in the United States as we would have elsewhere in the world that felt these input shortages, because we didn't feel the brunt of them as much as other folks did. The existing trade rules, unfortunately, aren't great. And this is why I and my co-author and a lot of the work that I've done, Tom Boyke, have actually proposed a COVID vaccine investment and trade agreement to try to address some of these things. So one is the existing WTO rules kind of discourage subsidies. And as Scott indicated, in this kind of environment, you just want to subsidize the right kind of subsidies, but the heck out of everything, or else you're going to suffer these trillions of dollars of losses. Well, there's an implicit bias in WTO rules that say, yeah, kind of don't subsidize. We need policymakers to get their heads around that quickly. And so there's probably a role for articulated carve-outs in saying, no, not only don't those subsidy rules apply here, we actually want to trigger subsidies getting implemented in governments helping to scale up production. There are WTO rules about discouraging export restrictions. They're generally banned, but there are public health exceptions. I think we want to be a bit more robust there. But at the same time, we have to also recognize that in many of these instances, the trade that's happening here is oftentimes, whether it's vaccines or some of these inputs, largely not happening through market conditions, right? We want governments to help being directing where these inputs are going, or it's really the governments that have been purchasing the vaccines. So kind of saying, well, we want to prevent export restrictions on vaccines is kind of a pointless exercise, because no government has made an explicit ban on exports of vaccines. It's just they bought all the supplies themselves, right, and not allowed any to go down. So we have to think harder about some of these rules. Okay, what else do we need? That as I've and others have observed, we need a lot more investment than what we saw, including over the full supply chain. The trickiness, though, is what happens when the key inputs that you need that need to be scaled up are located in a foreign country, and you can't subsidize them if you're a government because they're not within your jurisdiction. This is why we need this trade agreement to be more than a trade agreement, to be an investment agreement as well, to coordinate these subsidies across countries so that they scale up the entire supply chain. I think, if you'd given European government policymakers that were relying on inputs coming out of Merck Millipore or Sativa or one of these input providers in the United States, the capacity to subsidize those American firms in the way that Scott had indicated, so they build out another product line, maybe they would have done so, right? The problem is we just don't have the instruments to do that, but you need it in a trade agreement. We need a lot more transparency on vaccines and available inputs. We learned this lesson in the 2008-2010 period in agricultural products, when we had the commodity price spikes and lots of countries imposing export restrictions. The G20 developed this thing called the AMIS, the Agricultural Market Information System, that helped quell the fears this time around during the pandemic of food shortages when countries started to impose export controls. We need something similar in the medical supply space, especially for vaccines and inputs, to discourage hoarding, to discourage overbuying, for fear that, well, we really lack information as to what's going on and we want to protect ourselves. That really distorts things as well. But then finally, we're going to need administrators to help deal with the inevitabilities that we're going to sometimes run into these input shortages. So in the United States, again, DPA, you had logistics experts, you had Jeff Zients and the White House team kind of shepherding this, but you kind of need to scale that up globally, right? Over the just last week or 2 weeks ago, the US and the EU finally formalized their joint vaccine task force. Since March, Zients and the European Commissioner, Thierry Breton, have been coordinated on their vaccine supply chains across the Atlantic. But obviously these things are global. We need to bring India into the mix, obviously Switzerland, UK, and stuff as well, to help those flows of inputs that aren't going to be necessarily left to markets, but are going to be suffering from supply shortages and to deal with those. All right, I think that's all I have for now, but I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks for the opportunity to join you.
Thanks very much. I suspect that there will be a whole list of questions from my fellow committee members. So this time around, I will not invoke the chair's privilege. I will, let the questions come. Aaron.
Thanks very much to the panelists. I think this is for Jonathan mainly. You talked a lot about the resiliency with the generic drug industry, but just 2 days ago, we had Teva closing their Irvine facility. We don't know the list of medicines made in that factory. We know there will be shortages, but we just have to wait to find out. What is being done to improve the resiliency of the fill and finish of those facilities?
Well, one, we don't know what shortages. I mean, we don't know how competitive that marketplace is for those products coming out of the plant. So I don't know about the shortage. But as far as the resiliency of fill and finish, one of the things our companies when I say our companies, our member companies, so the generic industry, is they're looking at their supply chain and making sure that they do have the inputs in place, and they're tracking their supply chain and seeking greater number of inputs. Prior to COVID, through their drug master file, they may have identified 3 or 4 different API producers, for example, but they may only be taking the vast majority of that API from 1 or 2 companies. The companies that I'm talking to now are looking at, okay, how do we diversify the number of where we're actually importing that API from? And so they're looking at, okay, as we bring products into fill and finish, how do we ensure that we've got ample redundancy in our own internal supply chain? Now, when it comes to the fill and finish, I mean, I don't know, I can't speak to the situation at Teva, but I can tell you our companies have redundancies built into their own supply chains, and they will be looking for ways to fill the quantities that were produced there, I would guess, from the Teva. But from the perspective of our industry, the way the contracts are done in the generic space is there's always competition, and people are looking for ways to supplement. So there, I imagine the market will fill in any places that are that may be needed. But so sorry, I can't really address the Teva point. So I don't.
Other questions from the committee? Okay, well, I've got plenty. So maybe I could ask all of the panelists to respond, to the following. Our previous set of panelists, sort of acknowledged that some kind of greater international agreement to limit export bans or constrain export bans could have merit, but they pointed out, that it could be very time-consuming and difficult to negotiate. Right. It sounds like all 3 of you are in favor of an international agreement that, makes this kind of behavior less likely. How would you, respond to the, notion that it's going to be hard and difficult to negotiate? Right. I mean, how would you sort of make the argument that it would be worth, the investment of government officials' time and resources to actually get this done? And Jonathan, maybe we'll start with you, since your organization seems to have come down, pretty firmly in favor of something like this.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think it will not be an easy negotiation, but in a sense, the current environment we're in demands this. I think it's not just the United States looking at how to secure its supply chain. It's our allies around the world are having these same debates and same questions. So I think at first we can agree with our allies that there is the common goal of having this greater coordination and cooperation. I like how Chad was talking about, there's areas for cooperation in terms of investments. I mean, we look at comparative advantage, and there's definitely markets where there'll be more comparative advantage to invest in certain production facilities based on where the raw materials are coming from. And so that's something that we should benefit from. But I do think the challenge is, no one would have thought we would have had a vaccine in a year. Now, clearly a different issue, but I don't think the challenge is too great to begin having these conversations, because these discussions are happening around the world, and our allies are all asking these same questions. So I would encourage the U.S. government to move quickly and begin those conversations.
I guess what I would say, Lee, on that question is, if you have the ability to do these export bans in place, then I think what Scott has rightly pointed out is firms won't undertake the investment necessary to scale up production because they're going to say, I can't get the stuff out. Why am I going to invest in building this capacity? Because I'm going to be constrained in what I can sell into my local market. At the same time, I think you're going to have government policymakers, the local government policies say, why would I subsidize to build out that capacity if it's just going to be exported and the vaccines are going to go to people in other countries, right? So there's kind of a fine line, I think, to balance here, that all of these things have to be taken into consideration. You can't just have probably a focus on banning exports without getting coordination with other countries on they're also subsidizing and scaling up through public funding the supply chains to produce, to make sure that in the end of the day, with all of this, we get an equitable distribution of whether it's vaccines or PPE or whatever you're talking about at that particular moment.
Yeah, I totally agree. And let me maybe just stitch the two previous sets of comments together. Because of international comparative advantage, it's really in our best interest if, different ingredients and materials are produced where it's most efficient for them to be produced. But without a strong commitment to enable trade in those inputs and final products when they're produced, we're not going to see the right investment, both in any individual location or globally. And so it's in the US's strong best interest to have production of vaccines and PPE and everything made in the places where it is most effective, because that is the highest throughput, the highest total production value, and protects us the most. And again, right, I'm not an international treaty negotiator. I have no experience with doing this. I'm certain it's extraordinarily complex to do, especially when you're talking about something as fraught as ensuring the ability to export goods in times when you might need them yourself. First of all, it's super important to make it clear that precisely that commitment is what also ensures that you will have the things you need that when you need them. And second of all, that those commitments are worth a ton. Again, we're talking about trillions of dollars here. And so you want to be able to incentivize the upfront tens of billions or even 100 billion of investment to avoid, to offset the $1 trillion risks.
Thanks very much to all of you for your comments. Tony, once again, to my fellow committee members, any questions, comments, reactions to what the analysts, what the panelists have given us? Yeah, anyone? All right, so I think we may be reaching that point in the afternoon where people are experiencing that post-lunch lull in attention. But I drank extra coffee before this session. So if I could turn, briefly from, consideration of the shortages and trade frictions associated with the pandemic to, what I might refer to as the more recurrent or chronic shortfalls of supply, especially of, sorry to put you on the spot here, Jonathan, generic drugs, right? So, I think I'd ask you to address this, right? Would your organization, be in favor of particular trade policies or related policies that might help ameliorate some of these more chronic or recurrent supply shortfalls? Of course, it's not, something that characterizes the entire generic product space, but there are particular pieces of it where we have seen this. So I'd very much appreciate your response to that.
Sure. And I think a lot of the shortages in the marketplace are as much about market failure here in the United States as it is about the supply chain. I think it was noted earlier that, it's a very low margin industry. And the way our market is set up is that there's a lot of pressure to have lowest price possible and downward pressure, even if you're stuck, even if a company has a contract for multiple years in a row where that contract is in place. There's often a clause in that contract that if a lower price product comes in, you have X number of days to meet that price or you lose out on that contract. And so this continuous push of prices down farther and farther has some situations where companies actually are unable for profit reasons, for sort of margin reasons, to continue producing that product, and so actually will stop production of a product. And so we see some shortages related to those market conditions. And actually in the 100-day assessment of the supply chain by the Biden administration, they note these market pressures have on those issues. So I think identifying and solving some of those basic market challenges in the US could have a long way of promoting some more sustainability in the supply of medicines in the United States, and some of the shortage issues that you've noted in the generic industry.
Thanks. Any questions or comments from the committee? Yeah, so Chad, in your remarks, you suggested that if we're going to have an international trade agreement in this space, I mean, this is kind of switching back more. Oh, sorry, Aaron, you had a question. I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
No, you're doing awesome, Lee. Thanks for your questions. I guess when this panel started, Jonathan led with kind of a discussion about maybe we don't need as much transparency. Okay. I just wanted to clarify.
Disagree with that.
Okay.
In the CARES Act, which also gave the impetus for this work, the FDA was asked to begin collecting a source of API. Where is the API coming from? And this is something we as an association fully support. We would have liked to have seen that enacted by now. And we are encouraging the FDA to obtain whatever they feel they have to obtain from Congress, the authority to actually begin collecting that. So I would fully, we are behind increasing transparency and having a better understanding of where the supply chain is coming from.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, can I just weigh in on the transparency thing too? And of course I'm biased because I'm an empirical economist, and without data, I don't exist in the world. But I would just point, whenever you hear, and I'm not saying you said this, Jonathan, but I'm reading this in the semiconductor space that's coming out now with Commerce's requests for additional transparency, companies complaining about not wanting to have to turn it over. I mean, in the case of what we're talking about here, we can come up with ways to compensate folks for becoming more transparent. I mean, just look at Scott's numbers about how big the losses are that we're talking about here. There is so much money left on the table that if companies are worried about becoming slightly less competitive because they have to spend a little bit more to provide information to policymakers so they're making more informed decisions, there have to be ways that we can compensate for that, to provide for that information that's just so valuable.
Pausing again. Okay. Not trying to monopolize the conversation with our knowledgeable panelists at all. All right. So, Chad, you were stressing in your remarks, right, that, there needs to be a stronger international trade agreement in sort of the, pandemic related, drug device vaccine space, right? But you are also strongly pushing the idea that in addition to a trade agreement, there needs to be an investment agreement, right? That would allow us to make the, as an international community, that would allow the member nations of this treaty to coordinate investments, right? And to share information. Now, of course, this would make an agreement that combines both trade issues and investment issues, perhaps even more challenging to negotiate. But you're very strongly arguing for synergy between the two. Could you tell us a little bit more about the investment side, right? What the investment side of this treaty or agreement would look like? Are there precedents that we could build on? What would need to happen for that component to function as you wish it would?
So these are great questions. haven't been able to identify. There may be some out there, some other precedents that have done this, I think. But let me talk through why it's hard. So normally we don't do this kind of cross-country investments for rich countries, right? So if we're thinking about, the development bank, say the World Bank will help fund, do public-private partnerships in lots of developing countries around the world, but this isn't typically a phenomenon that we'll see in rich countries in normal times. But I think the pandemic has shown why it's potentially useful. And again, the priors are the supply chains are global. The input providers that I need to have access to, that my manufacturers need to have access to be able to scale up their production, may not be located in my country. So I need the foreign government to subsidize those input manufacturers, whether it's bioreactors or bags or cellular or whatever, if I'm going to be able to scale up my production facilities, but I don't have a direct fiscal mechanism myself to be able to do that. So you need to have some sort of cooperation here to be able to do it. Now, how to pull it off, I'm not sure. I don't have a template in mind, and I'm always hesitant. I'm married to a lawyer, but I'm always hesitant to allow lawyers the reins to kind of negotiate over these things. But you can see why, in the absence of this, there is a lack of sufficient subsidies. United States, the Trump administration, to their credit, did subsidize kind of the full, for the most part, vaccine supply chain. But I think they did it, with the American production base in mind. And we don't have access to all this great data, but from what I would one of the things that I did, and let me just talk briefly about this. When this Indian fiasco that Scott mentioned back in April came up, right? So the Indian CEO claimed the Biden administration had an embargo on vaccine inputs. Nobody knew anything, right? And eventually the White House shipped them some stuff that it had laying around, right? Was there an embargo? Was there not? What I managed to do was to track down some data. It's called bills of lading data. That was put together by a private company called Panjiva, and they were great and willing to share this with me. But what it basically allowed me to do was to look at what the Serum Institute of India and Biological E, these major vaccine manufacturers in India, had been buying from foreign entities over the last year. And so anything that gets imported into India, they have to fill out paperwork, and it's not just for us trade geeks. It's not just the product level HS, harmonized system codes. These are actually descriptions of the products that they're purchasing. And they digitized all of this data. I could look at it and see, oh my gosh, the Serum Institute has actually bought, this brand of whatever bioreactor from, this company. And I could then Google it, see how much that thing cost. Yep, it matched the numbers they were saying there. But this basically made the point that there was never an export embargo by the United States. It was simply that these Indian companies weren't able to access as much of these inputs as they wanted to, right? So there was clearly a bottleneck here that it took the Indian CEO on Twitter to have to call out the Biden administration for them to, put together, to address, right? And we shouldn't have had that happen. We should have mechanisms in place to kind of allow that transparency, to allow the scaling up of the production, to know that the Indian firms would need those inputs just as much as the companies in the United States and Europe were going to need them as well, to make sure that that wasn't actually holding up production. So I think there's just huge lessons that we can learn from these experiences, ingrain some of them as guardrails into trade agreements, because what trade agreements largely do is they create playbooks for how to, in sort of best practices for how to respond when different things come up. And so if we take these lessons, try to apply them into some kind of written framework, I think it could potentially be quite useful the next time around.
Totally agreed with all of that. Let me just quickly jump in on the mechanism point as well, if you don't mind. So one thing you could imagine as a beginning of a mechanism, I think there's going to be a better way to enshrine this in a formal agreement with sort of committed subsidies in the form of a treaty or some other sort of international agreement. But a beginning would be to have advanced purchase commitments for individual inputs or or products, alongside a commitment not to not to harm trade and exports. Right, an advanced purchase commitment says, I'm going to commit to buy this many bioreactors, this many bioreactor bags, whatever the case. If the company that manufactures those bioreactor bags in another country is certain that they will in fact be able to export them in the event that they're needed, right? In the event that that purchase commitment is called, then they will invest in the capacity to produce. Again, this is not as good as direct subsidies. You'd rather have an international fiscal mechanism to do it because that takes even more uncertainty out of the picture. But if you wanted to get a start, you could do it with a combination of a guarantee of trade and an advanced purchase commitment.
Yeah, Jonathan, feel free to jump in here, right? Academics and government officials are, considering policies that will mess with your industry. If you have any reaction, please feel free.
Well, my reaction was actually to be supportive of what they're talking about, because I'm thinking also in India. The Indian government identified 51 APIs and related KSMs where they felt they were too dependent on China. So they're investing billions of dollars to try to actually produce some of this in India. If there was an agreement that the US and India were both a part of, where there was greater transparency and possibility for coordinating, because I think when we looked at, I think there are 11 or 13 of those products were actually on the list of essential medicines the FDA published. That is, if there was a cooperative mechanism to say, okay, these are products that are important for the US healthcare system, maybe we don't need to be subsidizing and promoting the same type of production here if that is being taken care of by another country. So I think that is an opportunity where, again, some comparative advantage can be found, as well as comparative advantage in government support subsidies. I think why that's important from the industry standpoint is it's very difficult to set up manufacturing facilities in every market that's demanding that they locally produce. And so if there's a way that the US government can be coordinating and cooperating with its allies to encourage certain industrial bases to be expanded in different markets for certain APIs or finished pharmaceuticals, that will also help industry be more efficient in where it puts its resources.
Thanks for that. I'll pause again. Any questions from the committee? All right, so here's another, right? So the ambition of what is being discussed here in this Zoom call is sort of continuing to expand, right? So we're talking about a trade agreement, we're talking about investment agreement, but it sounds like at least implicitly, we're also talking about some kind of data sharing agreement, or at least data sharing rules and a data sharing infrastructure. This came out in Chad's remarks, it came out in Scott's remarks, and to some extent, Jonathan, it sounds like, you're at least implicitly, endorsing this, right? That, the world needs to know, right? What is being made where, where the supply chain bottlenecks are in an emergency, and perhaps, even in more normal circumstances. So I'd love each of you, to sort of give us your view on, what are the costs associated with this information sharing? How could those costs be met? How might we structure this in a way that, protects private interests appropriately, but also ensures that we achieve these public goals, especially in a pandemic type situation. And Jonathan, since you were the last to remark, maybe I'll ask you to be the first to respond to this set of issues.
And my answer may not sort of meet, I think Chad talked about the value of total transparency on this, because from the industry standpoint, one of the challenges with that type of fully open transparency, there's a lot of commercially confidential information. And some of the supply chain data is really, that's important for the companies to maintain that confidentiality. I think where we are supportive is the FDA as the regulatory authority, as the agency within the US government that has responsibility for tracking and alerting healthcare systems regarding shortages has that data and that information. I think from our perspective, there would be concern if this was fully open, just because, again, companies have to make these business decisions. Unfortunately, in some situations, and it was alluded to earlier, there are very few facilities that make a certain API or and so in those instances, it's, these companies are competing against each other in commercial marketplace, where again, for lowest price is the absolute sort of market determining factor. And so I think our view is there is a real need, and we appreciate that need for the regulatory authorities to have access to that information, but doing so in a way that it is open and transparent to all is probably not going to be supportive of the competitive marketplace where the generic industry operates.
Thanks. Can we get Scott and Chad to very quickly respond to this? And then we do have some questions from other committee members.
Cool. Let me actually just echo this view that there should be trusted data brokers. I think the FDA serving in that role in the United States is a great idea, but I also think there's a role for international coordination, on that side as well. This marketplace I mentioned, this pilot that CEPI sent up, which is a footnote, I and a couple of other people in the Accelerating Health Technologies group had some early advising on the initial launch, is exactly a trusted data brokerage to try and find excess supplies and/or supplies that are, and/or companies that are facing shortage, and manage sort of transactions to utilize all of those supplies to the greatest extent possible, without revealing publicly a lot of information about sort of which companies rather, and which suppliers had excess and/or shortage. And so, CEPI basically built a pilot. It's very much like this agricultural system that Chad mentioned. They built sort of a centralized data broker that companies could, both input suppliers and vaccine manufacturers could come to and report information about the state of their individual supply chains and sort of production levels in a way that would enable CEPI to try and coordinate and make sure that shortages were avoided without sort of producing a fully public record of everything that had happened. I think there's a lot of opportunity for that, both at the national and international levels.
Thanks, Scott. Chad?
The first thing I would say on this is to basically just hope everybody understands that Monica and sort of Carter's jobs now of these supply chain resilience task forces and things that they've had to stand up and have been on, my sense is this is the new normal, and that we should just see this as now, it's not a pandemic phenomenon, it's not a health phenomenon, it's kind of in a globalized world with cross-border supply chains. This is, and especially in a world where the likelihood of these big shocks is out there, whether it's pandemic or health or climate or political. This is the new normal, and so I think we need to be thinking about how to develop systems that can be durable and last, and that can kind of inform long-term policy. So I'm heartened that this stuff is taking place, but I would also encourage folks to think about how this can ultimately be sustained. To this question about data, and also I agree with Scott. I think what CEPI did with the COVAX marketplace is amazing, and it's only too bad that they didn't get the support to do it kind of earlier in the pandemic. I mean, the folks there are just incredible. So thanks, Scott, for helping to shepherd that. On the data side, I think, the way I think about it is, and I understand business confidential information, but on the other hand, anything that crosses a border gets logged in these bills of lading data, which then is ultimately out there, which then ultimately somebody has access to, and you can pay these companies to provide it for you. So it's available. It's just a question of who has access to the information. And my fear is the US government is kind of oftentimes the only one that lacks access to this information. And so would we rather create a system where the US government is Scott maybe indicated, the trusted broker of some of this stuff, or where everybody has access to key pieces of information and is on the level playing field versus some folks that are willing to pay for it have access to it, and others aren't, and especially the ones who aren't are the government policymakers that are tasked with shepherding, resilience and responsiveness and global public health in times of crisis like this.
I think we might have lost Lee for a minute. Alistair, did you have a question?
Yeah, I've really got two questions. One is to all of the excuse me, speakers. If you were given your wish for what you would get to improve the resilience of the supply chain, what would it be? Give us your two dreams, not with restrictions, not if you were God and you can get this done, what would you ask for? And the second thing is, which really comes back to what Chad just said, and he maybe said it better. What are each of your objections, if any, to visibility and transparency in the supply chain?
I can go first. So as far as sort of what would be most valuable in the supply chain in sort of creating greater resiliency, I think keeping the global nature of the supply chain open. So don't do anything that would impact the value of a globally diverse supply chain, at the same time while promoting incentives that would encourage greater US manufacturing. And things such as really the most important, again, when you look at the marginal cost differential between what it costs to produce many of the medicines on the essential medicine list here in the United States versus overseas and lower cost markets, you're going to need some type of subsidization from the government. So what would be important is to have long-term price and volume contracts where the government commits to a certain price and a certain volume over a certain period of time. So if those companies build that manufacturing capacity here in the United States, they know they're not going to be undercut by a less expensive imported product the day after they open the plant or a new line that was added. So I think it's keep the global market operating effectively and efficiently, and provide effective government support and long-term predictable marketplace for those products that are made here.
But just before we go on to the next question, these comments seem directly opposed to one another. Am I misunderstanding them? If you're keeping the global market open and at the same time you're going to subsidize US manufacturing, aren't these in conflict?
What I would say is I think there's a clear recognition that there is a political will on both sides, Republicans, Democrats in Washington, to see more US manufacturing. I think there's probably also, for essential medicines, a value in having more of that in the US. But essential medicines, I think on the FDA list, there were 220 products. The number of products approved by the FDA, I think, are 10,000 plus. And so it's for the vast majority of products, making sure that the market can operate effectively and efficiently with doing what we can to remove any trade barriers, whether it be export or increased tariffs, export barriers or increased tariffs. And so I would say there may be somewhat tension, but between those two, but I think it's recognition that for certain products, there's value in having them manufactured here in the United States.
Matt, did you want to raise that question with our panelists?
Sure. I'd be happy to. I guess, I'm not an expert in this area. And I've been trying to figure this out since the start of our project here. Is there any evidence that onshoring actually works, in the sense that, like, we've got things that are produced and, primarily manufactured in the US and others that are not? Is there greater reliability of US manufactured products? My sense as a clinician dealing with drug shortages is it doesn't seem to matter that much, that there are other factors that lead to shortages, and that production facilities in the US are not necessarily the big, you know, the big determinant of whether we're going to see a shortage for that product or not.
I mean, I think in the vast majority of cases, I would agree with that. I think, as I mentioned, there's sort of the political push right now to have greater US manufacturing. I think one area is where it does arise, and we're seeing this right now in terms of shipping delays now. And this is hopefully a very momentarily blip in the efficiency of getting products on cargo ships and into US ports, but we are seeing a situation where you know, there's delays in access to containers, delays in getting products on boats, getting off boats through customs. That is maybe one small place that, and as of now, that's not contributing to shortages. We hope it won't going forward. But I think what it can do, having a more robust manufacturing base in the United States for those essential medicines, is for that fill finish process, and for the small number of products where API is here, you can cut the time between production and when it accesses the patients. And if there is any disruptions in certain overseas markets, you have somewhat of a backstop. And I think that's why that globally diverse supply chain, and I think it was Carter who mentioned in the panel before, is you can't have reliance in any one market. So you don't want to see all the products for that particular, all the production for that particular medicine be here in the United States. But the US can support the production of some of that medicine for the US marketplace. So.
My favorite examples on this, and you know, this is all just anecdotes, of course, but when you're coming to you know, it's not obviously API, but when you're coming to vaccines, you know, obviously the most successful one that everybody has in mind is Pfizer, but that's not an American product, right? That's BioNTech's invention. If we didn't have globalization and supply chains, we wouldn't have those Turkish immigrant scientists in Germany giving us the world's most successful vaccine. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine was co-developed between, you know, Beth Israel and the R&D labs in the Netherlands. And with the fiasco of its production in the United States, just imagine if we'd only had that, right? Despite the fact that that was actually kind of good advanced pandemic planning to have that facility set up and to try to trigger it, and in real time, it just didn't work. And we were then reliant on what Johnson & Johnson we could get coming out of the Netherlands. Moderna, yes, an American invention, but had no production capacity, so was ultimately manufactured by a Swiss CDMO, yes, in New Hampshire facilities. But in any case, these things are global. And this is just kind of the reality that we confront. And that diversification, I think, in this instance of the pandemic, has helped us just as often as we can come up with examples for where it may have hurt us. And I think those are important to keep in mind.
Totally echoed. And just a quick reminder, the places where it feels like it may have hurt us often had positive spillover benefits to us as well, right? Like if what happened is we were enabling vaccination in some other country, that's, you know, reducing the emergence of new variants that come back to hurt us.
Yeah, I think I don't know that we've pulled those out, but it strikes me that those examples might be really useful of places where actually diverse supply chains across multinational arenas are actually stronger.
Very good points to note. Let me apologize to everyone on the call for the momentary loss of the internet here at Carnegie Mellon, you know, where the internet was partly invented. I guess maybe it's not my fault, but somehow I still feel the need to apologize. We are coming to the end of our time, and we only just have a few minutes left. You know, any members of the committee have any final questions for our panelists? All right, well, let me invite the committee staff. You know, if they feel that any point has not been, you know, explored, or if there's anything that we need to obtain before we all go away, now's a good chance to give us those reminders.
Great, thank you, Lee. This has been a really fantastic discussion. I just wanted to reiterate Lee's thanks to all of the speakers for taking the time to share your perspective on these important issues. A reminder that if any of the panelists would like to share materials with the committee, we welcome that. Just know that those materials will be made publicly available through our project public access file. So that's to ensure that the National Academies complies with Section 15 of the Federal Advisory Committee Act rules. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Lee, to adjourn the open session.
Okay. Yeah, so Scott, we'll get back to you with the email address for sharing materials. Thanks for that. Again, thanks to all of the panelists, and also thanks to my fellow committee members for engaging in this important discussion. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much. And everybody have a great afternoon. So long.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.